Today I would like to talk to you about Marath, Will of the Wild, for tiny leaders. Marath has a lot of very good abilities just built in. Red, white, and green creature. It enters the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. Now that means when you cast it from the command zone with the two extra colorless, means it would come in as a 5/5, 2 more after that would mean a 7/7. It also has the built-in ability that you can pay X and remove X +1/+1 counters from Marath, and then you can put a +1/+1 counter. You put X +1/+1 counters on target creature, deal X damage to target creature or player, or you can put an XX green elemental creature token onto the battlefield, which is unusual because it's not often that we get a creature that can do all these three abilities. As far as I can tell, this was only made for Commander 2013. It's a really, really good set of abilities. And so building a deck around these abilities, it combines very well with just lands in general. So let's get started with our lands. Now I chose because I wanted to play Marath, who's an elemental beast legendary creature, Contested Cliffs from the actual 2013 M2013 deck box. Its ability is it can tap for 1 colorless mana, or for 1 red and 1 green, tap target beast creature you control, fights target creature an opponent controls. That ability works very well with Marath, which is, of course, the only beast I'm actually playing. And that effect means that I can have Marath deal damage to a creature before it blocks. As it blocks, it gets around first strike this way. It can get rid of flyers because Marath will then be able to target them, so to speak. Now, obviously, it doesn't quite work the way if the creature has protection from red, green, or white, but in the event that you can't spend the mana to use Marath to kill the creature, like, let's say you have Marath with 5 counters on it. If you don't want to remove all 5 counters to deal 5 damage to something, you can use 1 and 1 green and have Marath fight it directly. That can help get rid of the creature. Then as far as mana base goes, I'm playing just a bunch of utility lands, good search lands. I want to make sure that I can cast Marath with whatever abilities I need. So I need to get those red, white, and green first 3 turns. And then I just have extra abilities that allow me to get that mana out. So Rith's Grove, which taps for red, green, and white. Mana Confluence, a couple of basic lands here and there. Jungle Shrine, because, you know, it taps for all 3 colors. Command Tower, of course. Then we have old cards from Marath like Mountain Valley and Grassland, which I believe were reprinted. And we have, well, I do have these older cards, Taiga and Savannah. I do not have a Plateau in this deck, and I don't have an Arid Mesa in this deck, but I do have the Windswept Heath and Wooded Foothills, so if I needed to, I could search for either one of these in a pinch. Temple of the False God, because we're playing a lot of lands in this type of a deck. Sunpellow Grove, because it's very unlikely that we won't have a forest or plains. Then the 3 shock lands from, I actually got these from the Return to Ravnica make sent. Now, once we get this land base out, and as you can tell, there's quite a few lands here. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 lands. Might be considered unusual in a tiny leader deck to play more than 20 lands, but we are playing utility lands, things like Contested Cliffs and Mutavault. Mutavault, Slayer's Stronghold, Kessig Wolfrun. These cards help boost Marath's ability. You can use the Slayer's Stronghold to suddenly give one of your utility creatures haste, in case you need to tap one of the creatures we're about to see later on. Or if you need to give it that extra boost of power, that's always good. Likewise, Mutavault gets around protection from decks. You can pour all of your colorless, pour your mana into Marath, move all the counters over onto Mutavault, and Mutavault actually counts as a beast for Contested Cliffs. So in a pinch, if you have something that's protection from red, green, or white, and you wanted to fight it to kill it, you could use Mutavault and Contested Cliffs to do that. Plus, just Etched Champion is a very viable deck type here in Tiny Leaders, so being able to block and or possibly remove an Etched Champion is always a good idea, especially when your opponent has Metalcraft. Now, with all this mana, you'd think we don't necessarily need that much more, but you'd be surprised. Marath is a very mana-intensive type of deck. You have to play as many mana sources as possible, which works very well in red and green, even a little bit in white. So it doesn't hurt us to play things like Thran Turbine. Thorium Turbine's from Urza's Saga. It's one colorless mana to get out. During your upkeep, you add up to two colorless mana to your mana pool, and the mana cannot be used to play spells. Now, way back when, this card was difficult to get into a real good deck type because you needed to be able to use that mana during your upkeep. Otherwise, you would take mana burn, and since mana burn isn't a thing anymore, it's not that big of a deal. You needed to have that utility. Back then, you paid echo costs with the Thorium Turbine. But what's cool about Marath is that X ability, you can use that during your upkeep with the Thorium Turbine to move counters off. And really what you want to do is get out as much mana as possible and keep recasting Marath to deal more damage, come out as an even bigger creature, put out 1/1 creatures, or just swing out with as much damage as possible. Pumping up your other creatures is also a very viable strategy in this deck type. Along the lines of the utility, I mean, this is just a general good utility. You could play this in any tiny leader deck, especially anything that has an activated ability that uses colorless mana. During your upkeep, I can use it. During my upkeep, I can use this on Slayer's Stronghold. I can use this on Kessig Wolf Run. I can use this on other cards that you're about to see. But it activates for Mutavault and all kinds of different things, cards we haven't even discussed yet. So Thorium Turbine, since you can't play Sol Ring in this format, it's not a bad idea to play Thorium Turbine instead. It's just a general use good card. Now, speaking of general use good cards, Mother of Runes is another just nice utility creature that plays very well in any deck that includes white. This is one from Urza's Legacy. It's 1 white mana for a 1/1 creature that taps and gives a target creature you control protection from a color of your choice until end of turn. If you've ever wondered why it says target creature you control, it's because if you could target your opponent's creature, you could make your opponent's creature lose an enchantment that's put on that. Any aura that is of that color would fall off the creature, which would have been really too powerful, if we're just being honest here. So, if you ever get an opportunity, you have a card that gives any creature protection from a color. If it's not your own creature, you can target your opponent's. Remember that you can make an aura fall off by using that ability. Now, since the format of Tiny Leaders doesn't take into effect commander damage like regular commander does, where it's 21 and you lose, life gain works extremely well in this deck type. In fact, it works so well, you can play a series of creatures that gain life whenever a creature comes into play. For example, you have Suture Priest. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, and that's repeated with these 3, except these also they also include your opponent's creatures coming into play. In this type of a deck with Marath, you can pay 1, remove 1 counter, put a 1/1 creature into play and gain life, and you can do that as many times as you want. You can remove 3 counters and put a 3/3 creature into play if you wanted to, and that wouldn't hurt you. Sometimes that's a good idea because Marath would put out a green creature, so if it's a protection from red or protection from white, having a green creature out, things rarely have protection from green in Tiny Leaders. So that's a decent strategy. Likewise, when you're working with life gain, you could play something like Basilisk Collar, or anything that gives your creature lifelink. Luxodon Warhammer, for example. But Basilisk Collar works very well because you can put it on Marath and give him Death Touch as well as lifelink. So you can pay 1, remove a counter, and deal 1 damage to any creature in play, provided it doesn't have protection from that color, and that would kill the creature, making this very good. I mean, we talked earlier about using Contested Cliffs with Mutavault. That same thing applies here. If you have the mana to spend, and you probably will, you can put Basilisk Collar on a Mutavault and then have it fight another creature. You'd gain that much life, and it would have Death Touch, so it would automatically kill something, which is, of course, a decent strategy. It's unusual to play life gaining like that, but it is viable that in the event you don't get Marath or Marath is countered in some way, you do have a means of sticking it out. So you can gain enough life that hopefully you get to 30 and Sarah's Ascendant becomes a 6/6 flyer. It's also very nice because Sarah's Ascendant, you can put it out and then use Marath to put all those counters onto the Ascendant to get extra damage because Sarah's Ascendant has lifelink. So we have our life-gaining strategy as well. And if that weren't enough, you need ways to deal with protection. Protection from red, protection from green, and protection from white, and that's why we have cards like Blasting Station. Like I said earlier, just having protection in general because of swords, because of extra effects and being able to suddenly give something protection from a color, Blasting Station works very well to get around that. Specifically, Marath Will of the Wild has the ability to put out creatures like 1 at a time by pulling off +1/+1 counters. When you do that, Every time a creature comes into play, Blasting Station will activate. It will untap itself. You can tap the Blasting Station and sacrifice a creature to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. And that's very important because you can keep stacking up that damage and eventually deal enough damage to kill off whatever it is that's giving you a problem, provided it doesn't get protection from artifacts or have hexproof to begin with. If it doesn't have protection from artifacts or hexproof, well, we might as well get into the +1/+1 counter effect. It's unusual because being able to move +1/+1 counters around is very, very good, especially in a format where you don't get things like Doubling Season. But Mikaeus the Lunarch, you can pull a counter off of Marath to put on Mikaeus, and then you can tap Mikaeus to remove that counter and put +1/+1 counter on everything else, including Marath. So they feed back into each other quite well. Likewise, you can pull all of the counters off of Marath onto Gear Sage, and Gear Sage is able to then tap for that much green mana. In fact, that's a terrific place to put all of those counters, because once you cast Marath, you want to start getting those counters off and then casting Marath again. And this is just the perfect combo. By pouring all that mana onto the Gear Sage, the next turn you can cast Marath again, and Gear Sage will make up the difference in any amount of mana that's lost. Not to mention, if you've done it right, the amount of counters you pull off of Marath onto the Gear Sage will be enough that Evolve will trigger when Marath comes into play. So you should always be able to pay it off by using Gear Sage and Marath. Then we get to a card that doesn't quite work the same way, but works along the lines of the Contested Cliffs, and that's Falconwrath Exterminator. Falconwrath Exterminator, it's a 1/1 creature for 2 mana, 1/1 red. Whenever it deals damage to a player, you put another +1/+1 counter on it. And then for 2/1 red, it deals damage to the target creature equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on Falconwrath Exterminator. This card is a terrific target for Basilisk Collar. You can use it during your upkeep with Thran Turbine to deal that damage. And once it swings out, it gets another +1/+1 counter by not being blocked, making it an excellent card, even though it's only an uncommon. Most people overlook those kind of cards. Now we have to talk about what gives us our card advantages. Although it's not obvious, we need to have as much mana as possible, and we need to get our lands as quickly as possible. And this type of deck gets around that by playing cards like Sylvan Library, Mentor of the Meek, Horn of Greed, and Course of Crufix. Course of Crufix helps you filter the top card of your library. It's not a true draw card, but it makes sure that you're not drawing the land, so you're getting the next card that it could be. Plus, it's a nice life-gaining effect. I don't include it for the life-gaining effect as much. It's mostly in there to filter the land drops. Same. Horn of Greed, whenever any player plays land, that player draws a card. This can benefit your opponent, but that's something you just have to go with because you're actually trying to, well, you're not necessarily trying to stop them from playing lands, but your deck is more efficient at it. I do need to point out, though, that cards like Grassland, Mountain Valley, Wooded Foothills, and Windswept Heath, these are effects that put lands into play. They're not technically a land drop. You're not playing the land. They will trigger for Courser Crufix, but you're not the player that plays the card. You do not draw a card for putting one into play with that effect. You do draw a card. It says you may play the top card of your library if it's a land card, so that does count as playing the land for the turn. That's fine. But it doesn't count when it's put into play by an effect or an activated ability. So this only works if you can get out extra land drops. And speaking of, Horn of Greed combines better with actually playing the lands. Let's try to keep our top cards available. Horn of Greed works very well with Exploration, where you can play an additional land each turn. So you could play 2 lands with Horn of Greed and draw 2 cards. And that works. That works very beautifully. And that's why it's a good combo, because we need plenty of mana ramp in this deck. That's why we're playing Birds of Paradise, Sylvan Carrot, and Draga Tree Speaker. I'd also consider putting in Whisper of the Wilds, because you'll get Marath out with the +1/+1 counter fairly easily. You should be able to pump something else up, and you should get that 2 mana out of it. I played Draga Tree Speaker because you can get it out on turn 1, and on turn 2 pop something else out, or pay 1 green to level it up, and then cast something else, like a Sylvan Carrot perhaps. Sylvan Carrot is also in the deck because hexproof is extremely important in Tiny Leaders, being able to block something without flying especially. And then we have our just utility cards in general. Explore lets you play an additional land. If you get out the Horn of Greed or the Exploration doesn't come up, you get to draw a card with it. Tithe allows you to search for 2 Plains cards, which you'll notice I was playing Temple Garden and Sacred Foundry, Actual Plains, and Savannah. These are all good targets for Tithe because they are technically Plains cards. Of course, if you only get one land out of it, that's perfectly fine. If you're going second and you play your land on your first turn, it produces white. On their turn, when they play a land, you can cast Tithe. They'll have 2, you'll have 1, and you'll get to search for 2 lands to put into play, which benefits Horn of Greed as a strategy. And now we're getting into the really kind of interesting charm type of cards. Selesnya Charm is just an excellent removal card. You can give Marath Trample if you don't get the Kessig Wolf run and you need to get that damage in. Selesnya Charm works very well for that. If they get out a creature that's a little too powerful, that Marath can't deal with it, you can exile it instead. Or you can put out a 2/2 white creature in response to combat, or something that you want to during your blocker step to block a card. Or, during combat. Rith's Charm destroys a non-basic land, which is always good, especially if somebody plays Maze of Ith. You can put 3+1/+1. You can put 3/1/1 green sapling creature tokens into play, or prevent all damage a sorcerer your choice would deal. In the case of putting out 3 green sapling tokens, with the Soul Warden and Soul's Attendant and all those cards, you get to gain 1 life for each of them. That's 3 life right there, minimum. Or being able to prevent all damage from a sorcerer your choice. You can choose a source that, if I'm not mistaken, you'll be able to prevent all damage it would deal this turn. Effectively, if they put out for example, an infinite power, or a creature that has just an enormous amount of power and toughness, you can choose that creature doesn't deal any damage this turn. Meanwhile, Naya Charm, it deals 3 damage to target creature, or you can return a target card from a graveyard to its owner's hand, or you can tap all creatures target player controls. Being able to tap down your opponent's creatures and just swing out with everything is a winning move. Obviously, they might have fog. They might have some kind of an effect that keeps you from dealing damage. That is possible. But being able to deal 3 damage to a creature as a removal is good. Being able to return a card from graveyard to your hand is good for anti-counterspell type of cards. So we're getting into the home stretch. We're almost at 20 minutes. Hopefully I can still upload this video. Hardened Scales. Doubling Season isn't playable in Tiny Leader's format, but Hardened Scales comes pretty close. We showed enough cards that put +1/+1 counters on your creatures, so Hardened Scales and Marath just being able to put the counters on the creatures by itself really makes the deck very, very popular. Not popular, but very powerful. You're able to get a lot of effect out of Hardened Scales with Marath. Not to mention, Marath, the first time you cast it with Hardened Scales out, will come into play with 4 counters instead of 3, because Hardened Scales is a replacement effect. It says whatever you're about to do, well, you're actually doing 1 more than that, and that's great. And since the only card in this deck that actually produces tokens is Marath, and is Marath that puts +1/+1 counters on it, there is a Doubling Season type of card for this deck, and that's Illusionist Bracers. Illusionist Bracers is a 2 casting cost equipment card, and it says whenever an ability of equipped creature is activated, if it isn't a mana ability, copy that ability, and you may choose new targets for the copy. It costs 3 to equip, but when you get out Marath and you put Illusionist Bracers on Marath, that means you can remove 1 counter to deal 1 damage and another damage, or you can remove 1 counter, put a counter on this creature and a counter on that creature, or 2 counters on the same creature. Or you can use the ability to put out 2 different 1/1 tokens, and for 1 mana, it doubles the effect, like a Doubling Season. Also interesting to note with these 2 cards, if you have Hardened Scales and Illusionist Bracers, or one or the other card on Marath, you can remove 1 counter from Marath, and target Marath to put the counter back on. Hardened Scales will see this as a +1/+1 counter and multiply it to 2. It'll become 2 +1/+1 counters for one colorless mana. Likewise, Illusionist Bracers, you can pull 1 counter off Marath and put 2 counters back on Marath. So Thran Turbine essentially is a free doubling effect that permanently boosts the power and toughness of Marath Will of the Wild. Alright, so that's the deck. It's kind of the deconstruction for how the deck works together and all the synergy that is available in this deck. I hope you enjoyed. This is one method of playing Marath Will of the Wild in Tiny Leaders. You do not have to follow this. You can play, well, red, green, and white are excellent for land destruction and mana ramp and protection, and it's a decent color combination just all around. But this is my version of it. This is how I play it. I hope this inspired you a little bit, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, a wonderful afternoon, or a wonderful evening, and I hope tomorrow's even better. Take care, everybody.